Starting and thank you, teens. Go ahead, Megan.
All right. Hello, my name is Megan Longoria, and today I'm talking about making paginated reports more accessible. I've been in the BI and analytics space for about 15 years, been doing this for a while and doing consulting for over a decade now. I just got renewed as a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, and I've been interested in accessibility for about 6, 7 years now. Um, I started out testing Power BI interactive reports to see what that was like for someone who um, was using a screen reader and found out the experience was not great, but then the product improved over time. And so I took that and then turned my attention to presentations like in PowerPoint. And now I've turned my attention to paginated reports and what we can do to make life a little easier, make things more productive for people who are using our paginated reports that we make. I'm based in Denver, Colorado. My social stuff is at the bottom of the screen. Please excuse my dog, who is so enthralled with my presentation that she's probably napping here on the side. So I'd like to start out with a question. Just ask this of yourself. Do you in any way incorporate accessibility into your normal paginated report design process? I've asked this of several people now, and whether I talk about paginated reports or interactive reports, I get about the same answer. And that is like 90% of people do not. They do not think about accessibility at all when they're designing their reports. So if that's what you were thinking to yourself, it's okay. You are in good company. But I want to walk through a couple of responses that I got, even from people who should know better, people at Microsoft, people who are great report designers. And let's talk about a better way to think about this. So, something that I get as a common response when I ask this question is, well, no one in my audience is disabled. And I have to ask, are you sure? I hope that I inspire you during this presentation to never default to this response. Because 1 in 4 adults in the US, and the statistics vary across countries, but this is pretty typical of Western countries, European countries, as well as US, Canada. So 1 in 4 adults has some type of disability. There is a huge employment gap between adults of the same characteristics, accounting for ethnicity, race, gender, all of that, those who are employed with a disability and those who are employed without a disability. The difference is about 40 percentage points. It's something like 39.6% of people in the US with a disability are employed, and it's 70 something for those without. So we want to help people. A lot of this is because there's a lack of accommodations, and we want to help people be able to do their jobs without running into needless obstacles. So, one small way that we can affect this is to make accessible reports in a incredibly information-driven age. Everyone uses reports. So, we want to try to lower this gap by doing our small part in our design. And so when I say, are you sure that really no one that's reading your reports has a disability? They'll go, well, that's not the people I work with. I know the statistic, but, and I'll say, how do you know? Because and this is a 2017 statistic, but it's probably holding about true. This is from Coqual. 30% of college educated employees working full time in white collar jobs have some kind of disability. And this was actually a global survey, so not just US focused. And it included 3M, Microsoft, IBM, Walgreens, a lot of big places. And people will tell me, but no one's ever asked for an accommodation. And my response is, why force them to? The issue is that more than a third of people with disabilities have experienced either discrimination or negative bias in the workplace. And 39% of employees with disabilities tell their manager. That's a huge chunk of people who never even disclose to their manager that they have a disability and may need an accommodation. Even fewer tell their team members, and even fewer than that tell human resources. So, the conclusion we draw from that is that you're excluding a portion of your audience if you wait for someone to request an accommodation, whether it's a cognitive disability, a visual disability, a motor disability. It's less affecting reports, but audio, oral disability, hearing. People shouldn't have to come up to us when we have tools and practices that can accommodate them from the beginning. So, if I asked you what comes to mind when people say accessible data visualization or accessible reporting, I would say the first thing that comes out of most people's mouths is color blindness. And that is a good example, but there's actually a lot more than that. Um, Color blindness affects about 5% of people worldwide. It but low vision just on its own is more like 30%. 13% has a motor impairment. 11% of people have a cognitive disability. 9% of people have ADD or ADHD. So while it's good to learn all about color blindness or color vision deficiency, we'll talk about my soapbox on that in a second. There are lots of other people who may have invisible disabilities that you're not aware of, especially if a lot of your report audience is working from home and you don't see them. But even then, some visual and cognitive disabilities are not visible. You just don't know unless someone discloses to you. So, if we start thinking about accessibility, we can break it down into different design attributes. For instance, keyboard interactivity and navigation. Your paginated reports can be keyboard accessible as far as setting the filters and navigating between pages. All of that can be done without a mouse. Color is a huge, important design attribute, both for color vision deficiency and low vision users. Shapes. Shapes stand out to us. And so we can use them intelligently, smartly to draw focus to the right things, which can help with cognitive disability as well as visual disabilities. Alt text for those who use a screen reader. We can add alt text into our paginated reports. So at the very least, someone will get a description of a visual, a nice maybe summary explaining what data is in there and why it's included or what conclusion we might want to draw from that. And then explanatory text. It is okay to put a text box with a paragraph of information, either telling people how to use your report or explaining something in the report where the data came from, anything that cuts down on our cognitive load, the amount of stuff we have to think about and process to read our reports. And then, of course, titles. Titles of visuals. Can I put a nice title on the table or on a chart to let someone know what they're about to see so they can decide how much effort they want to put into reading our chart? So, those are the design attributes. And if you keep those in mind, really, we can become much more accessible by just increasing our awareness of about how people consume information, which we'll talk a little bit about here today, and then incorporating small changes. Most of the things I'll show you today take 5 minutes or less to do. So I'm not asking you to change everything about how you design reports, I'm saying, okay, do this and then maybe check your colors, or do this and add tooltips for alt text. Most of these things are very small, and once you start doing them routinely, they just become part of your process, and you really don't think about it anymore as this extra thing. It's just part of your design process. So when we talk about accessible design, there are some common guidelines. This is not necessarily the end all be all, but if you need something, some kind of guideline to go against, WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is a good place to start. When organizations need to test something for accessibility, these are usually the guidelines that they use, and they get updated periodically. So you'll see them advance as science and technology advances. But right now we are on version 2.1. So if you work for a government agency or a school, or really anywhere that creates reports, in this case, for the public, or if you're a federal employee, or if you're, let's say, a design or consulting company that develops something for the federal government or uses any kind of federal funds, you are subject to Section 508, which aligns with WCAG currently 2.1. So lots of state agencies get federal money and they also adhere to it, which is why I mentioned schools. Pretty much all public schools in the US want to be 508 compliant. If you are outside of the US, you probably have a different guideline, but a lot of guidelines will align themselves with WCAG. So it's all the same set of guidelines now, whereas it used to be lots of different things. When we look at web content accessibility guidelines, there are three parts to it. There's the general guideline. So in this example, guideline 1.4 is about distinguishability. Then there's a success criteria. In this case, it's use of color. And then there are different levels of meeting that success criteria. So level A, color is not used as the only visual means of conveying information or distinguishing a visual element. We'll talk about exactly what that means as an example here in a second. So there may be single A, double A, and triple A. All of WCAG is written like this. We get our guideline, our success criteria, and then our levels. So all this one means is that, let's say we have a table. Our table shows current year sales by product. We have in the table the product and the current year sales, but the sales amounts are colored differently. And those colors actually represent a comparison to the prior year sales. So dog treats and dog food, our sales are greater than the prior year, but dog toys have sales lower than the prior year. A person with color vision deficiency or color blindness might not be able to tell the differences in colors, especially if they need to know specifically that red is lower and green is higher, not just that the colors are different. So the way to meet this level A, or one way to meet it, is we could just add a separate column. So if we, again, have a table with current year sales by product, and we have our current year sales column, we can actually leave the color if we want to and just add another column that says year over year sales and whether it's up or down. And now we have met the success criteria. So let's look at one more. This one is more about cognitive accessibility. So we need a mechanism for identifying specific definitions of words or phrases used in an unusual or restricted way, including idioms or jargon. How does this apply to reports? We love jargon and abbreviations. It is pervasive. We abbreviate things. We have a special name for it. Even if you feel like your company or your organization is pretty good about it, simple things like revenue be confusing for someone who's new to your organization. So I used to work in finance and accounting, doing reporting for them. And does revenue mean purely operating revenue? Does it, what does it include? What currency is it in if you're in a multinational organization? There's lots of questions. You can't just say rev in my example. We've also abbreviated our products. So treat, food, and toys. Maybe, back in the day, a lot of systems had a short name because in reports or certain screens, there just wasn't enough room. Our pixel count is higher these days, our resolution is higher these days. We usually have room to spell out a whole product name. So instead of CY sales by product with abbreviated products and the word rev as our column header, what if we just say current year sales in dollars by product and label our column sales in USD? Same information, but likely much clearer on the right compared to the left. So that is how we can um, eliminate rather the issue of jargon. The other way to do it is to add a glossary. Put something on your page that links out to a business glossary that has definitions, or put it in a tooltip somewhere where we can explain, what do we mean by this? It's usually better if it's on the page that someone is looking at, because if we have to click off and go somewhere else, we've taken our attention away from it. But having a glossary is a useful thing and it meets this criteria. So I'm going to start with cognitive accessibility, and then we'll end on some of the more common color blindness and color contrast stuff. And really, the entire point of cognitive accessibility is that we want to try to remove distractions and reduce the effort it takes to consume our reports. The bottom line is cognitive load. Anytime you take in information, you read a chart, you read words, your brain requires processing power. Our working memory, the amount of stuff we can hold in our head and access at one time, is fairly limited. So we want to be very intentional about what we present to people. There are different types of cognitive load. Intrinsic cognitive load is about how complex the actual information is in itself. You have a very complex topic that you're showing data for. There is germane cognitive load, and that's more about an individual consumer. So if the topic is new to someone, they have to expend more energy than someone else who's an expert on the topic. Extraneous cognitive load is not about the information itself, but it's about the way the information is presented. And this is where most of our report design stuff comes in. We can largely affect extraneous cognitive load. And then there's also perceived cognitive load. And that is when someone opens your report, how difficult do they think it will be to get the information they need out of it? Have you ever opened a report and it was just super busy and hard to read, and you just went, nope. You close the window, you're done. I just can't do this right now. You were reacting to perceived cognitive load. So our job as paginated report designers is to affect the extraneous and perceived cognitive load as best we can, as well as maybe to be mindful of the germane cognitive load. Can we make our reports easier to use for someone who needs the report but is less familiar with a topic? But mainly, we can control the bottom two. One of the ways that we can control cognitive load is through what are called affordances. If you've ever read the book, The Design of Everyday Things, it talks about physical affordances. We have digital affordances. So, what is the existing knowledge that users have? For instance, familiarity with a user interface. And what kind of consistent design can we use to make it really clear, very obvious, how to interact with our reports. So, in paginated reports, this could be just using a consistent color palette. As people switch from section to section in your report, they don't have to relearn what colors mean in every chart. Consistent formatting of text and visuals. It's not that you should never change fonts or font sizes or borders or anything like that. It's that we want to do so purposefully to indicate some kind of change in meaning or to highlight something. Because when something changes in our design, users notice it and they go, okay, what is this signaling to me? So let's make sure we're purposefully signaling. And then we can choose chart types that are easy to interpret. And that's a little bit subjective. It's based on your audience, your intended audience. If it's people who are extremely sophisticated and they understand all the data viz in the world and they're very familiar with it, maybe you have a little more leeway in chart types. If it's people who need to get information really quickly and they don't spend a lot of time in analytics, something like a bar chart is probably more familiar to them. So affordances reduce our extraneous cognitive load because they are affecting the way we present the information. For cognitive accessibility, there are a few design attributes in our paginated reports that are specifically helpful for accessibility. And the first is chart titles. I mentioned this earlier. What can we put in our chart title to be very specific to help someone understand what they're about to read? Text boxes and captions. What information could I add to try to answer someone's questions about the data, the presentation of the data, or how to use the report in general? Tooltips. When we hover over something, what kind of information should we see that would help someone who's unfamiliar with the chart, with the data? And I'll give you a caveat to this in just a second. And then, of course, navigation and interactivity. We control this a little bit less because it's mostly kind of the frame of the paginated report where we interact with filters and things. But we can have a little bit of interactivity in our reports. And so we need to make sure that we've maybe used those purposefully to put only the amount of information we need to start with and then let people interact to get more. And two, made sure that any kind of clicks or drill throughs that we need, if you have a matrix and you need to expand the boxes, that type of thing is very obvious for our users. We can also just add usage guides. You can have a link in your report that says, need help? Here's a guide to help you use this report if you feel like it takes up too much room to embed that within the report. So we'll run through these real quick. And I promise there are several demos as we get towards the end. Don't be afraid to add text boxes. Text is okay. We don't want a busy report, but if it helps the user understand how to interpret the information you're giving them, how to use your report, it's great. If you're actually showing charts or a lot of data maybe in a table and they need to understand the general trend of it, you can just put that in text. And we said how to use the report. Explain if you're going to use an unusual, a lesser used chart type, you might want to explain how to interpret the chart. Or if you've used a data point in a way that may not be obvious, you can explain that as well. For jargon or acronyms, again, we can replace our acronyms and jargon. So that was our table where we said products that were abbreviated and rev, and we switched it out for a nice title that explained what we're getting, the full product names, and a more specific column name for the amount. So we know that it is in fact sales in USD. And then we can add a glossary where we can't replace it. So in general, again, for cognitive accessibility, We want to make information obvious, and we want to keep things from getting complicated, not complex. Sometimes information is complex, but we don't want to overcomplicate our graphs. We want to minimize distractions. We want to have consistent user interfaces that are as simple as possible to use, given what we're trying to accomplish. We want to use easy to read typeface. Fancy script fonts usually do not have a place in a paginated report because they're not very easy to read. We tend to go for like a sans serif font if it's a summary kind of dashboard style report. If there's a lot of text in there, there may be a case to make for using a serif font, but in general, common fonts that have very clear letter strokes. And I'll show you a couple examples of issues that can arise in your typeface. And then we'll avoid overly complex language. Again, if we can replace or remove the jargon, that's great. If not, we do a glossary. So that starts us out with cognitive accessibility. Next, we'll talk about screen readers. There are, especially with paginated reports, I think, actually several users who are low vision or no vision that want to read your reports, especially if you make reports for the public, especially if they're getting exported. So we need to be aware of what we can do to make our reports better used by a screen reader. And most people do think of screen readers for people that are blind, but there's a big user base that is not completely blind at all. They use a screen reader to help them, even though they're low vision, not actually blind. Remember that even if you think someone might not use your report with a screen reader, the chances are someone will come around, especially as technology advances. So even if no one in your intended audience today is doing this, they might later. And wouldn't it be great if you already had that set up so that a screen reader user could read your report appropriately? So the first tip is alt text. The tooltips that we can add on a visual actually translate to alt text for screen readers. This is that caveat I said earlier. We want to make sure that a screen reader user gets what they need from the tooltips when they can't see a chart. So yes, we want to add explanatory text in our tooltips sometimes, but we want to make sure it's also appropriate for screen readers. The other thing that is interesting with a screen reader is if somebody really can't see the report, the rendering engine sets the reading order of your report by sorting by Y, the vertical axis, and then X, the horizontal axis coordinates. So if something is in the very top left corner, it's going to read that first. If the next thing is in the top right corner, that's second. And then bottom left corner would be third and bottom right corner would be fourth. We want to set our structure type in our tables and matrices, and I have a demo for this. We want to set heading type in text boxes. And then we want to make accessible PDFs. I'm going to start with that one to show you what I'm talking about here. We can set headings in our text boxes. We can set different levels of headings. We can say, just like in HTML, we can say this is a heading level 3 or a heading level 4. When a screen reader user comes into a report, they can hit a keyboard combination that basically lists all the contents, all the landmarks in a report. So right now I'm showing you the headings available in the demo country sales performance report. This is a report that's available from the Paginated Reports team. And this is what you see. So it starts out with country sales performance. That's a heading. Expand salesperson is a heading. And then it gets into the table, and we'll see it showing the table headings, the column headings there. And then we get to the bottom, and notice that it reads page 1 of 2 before the disclaimer. And I didn't modify this in any way to change these headings. I'm just showing you an example. And then we go to page 2. So we get country sales performance, expand salesperson, the table again. And at the bottom, there is a total, and that was marked as a heading. And then the page number and the disclaimer. This may not be the order that we want it to be in. So this is a good thing to check. And I'll show you some of the places where you adjust these things. So I'm going to open the country sales report. And every text box has an accessibility option. And this is overwrite structure type. So it's going to tag it appropriately so that when someone exports this as an accessible PDF, it will put it in the right location as far as landmarks, the right level. So maybe this thing is a heading level 3 because it's the very first top most important thing. And then maybe this text box for expand salesperson is a heading level 4. So if it's a text box, you control the heading level, or you can say it's not really a heading if it's just information like you have explanatory text. If you have a table or matrix, you can go in the cell properties, and I marked this one already. By default, it'll say none. And you can say whether this is a row header cell, a column header cell, or a data cell. So what I did was I went through the top row here, which is my column headings. Oh, no, I didn't save it. Good. And so I may want, oh, wrong thing. There we go. I may want to say this is a column header cell. So this is the header for all the cells below it, which is mostly true in this case. So I would go through and set each of those. This report, I'm going to run it real quick so you can see it again. Happens to be, there's a country, and then underneath there's a salesperson. So I'm kind of using Australia as my, it's not quite a row header, so you have to make a decision there. So I may mark the country as a row header cell or a data cell. I'm going to call this a data cell. Same thing for sum of sales. So all of these have an accessibility. I did this one already. Have this accessibility option so that it actually properly tags the table when someone reads it as an HTML file or accessible PDF export. So we want to go in and do that for our screen reader users. All right, now we're going to get to the color part. This is usually the obvious part, but this also has like a bunch of fun tools we can use, and I'll show you a couple demos. So color contrast is really important. It's what makes things stand out. It's what makes things readable. And in WCAG standards today, color contrast is based upon relative luminance. And luminance is the brightness of one color compared to another color. So black has 0 luminance, white is 1. And the criteria, the success criteria you're trying to meet, there's a different color contrast ratio depending on if it's a text object or a non-text object, and then the size of the text. So let's say we're going to just have a couple shapes and some text. I have an outer green square, an inner gray, light gray square, and dark text. Therefore, I have color contrast ratios for my text to its background And then I have a color contrast ratio for this inner square to the outer square and the outer square to its background. So, especially if somebody needs to interact with a shape or read what's in a shape, this is important. So here I switched my colors around and I've got dark text on a medium to dark background. And for most people, this is usually less readable. So let's take a look at color contrast in text. I said I would show you some of this, different kinds of text to read. So let's look at our first line. I've got a light background with dark text versus a medium to dark background with dark text. The left one is usually more readable for people. It has a higher color contrast. This is something I run into all the time. Let's just have light gray font on a white background. That's very difficult for people, most people to read, much less people with low vision who probably have a harder time reading that. Same thing goes if you have dark text on a dark background. We want to make sure that our text and its background are usually opposites. So we have dark text on a light background, light text on a dark background. Either one of those is acceptable. We just try to avoid light text, light background, dark text, dark background. In this presentation where I've used some purple text, this purple, dark purple with a white background, has a color contrast of 9.5 to 1. If we do kind of a medium blue with a medium gray background, that's 2.3 to 1. So it's a lot lower color contrast. Black text on a white background has the highest color contrast, and that's 21 to 1. You won't see this much in data visualization or in news articles and things like that, because people tend to not want to go to the extreme. That's too much contrast. So they'll do something slightly off black or off white to make it a little easier. So when we do charts, we need to think about color contrast in multiple places. We need to think about the text, like in our titles and series, against its background. We need to think about the bar to its background, and we need to think about the bars compared to each other. So if we look at WCAG standards, text smaller than 18 points, which is most of the text in your reports usually, minus maybe a title or something, needs to be at least 4.5 to 1 for the color contrast. If it's bold, it can be 14-point font. Text that is 18 points or larger can have a 3 to 1 color contrast. That's minimum though. Like if you can make everything 4.5 to 1, that's usually better. Graphical objects and UI components, think like the filters at the top of the page, any shapes that you have, they should have a 3 to 1 contrast ratio from their background. Oops. So there is a mathematical formula that is published, and there are a billion and one color contrast tools out there that you can use. So I'll show you a couple. This is accessible-colors.com. And the reason that I like this one is because I can put in my text color, the size and the weight of my font, and the background color, tell it which of those levels I want to pass. So AA is 4.5, and let it tell me if I have passed, and if I have not passed, it'll say you could change this background color just a bit, and then it could pass. Or you could change the text color just a bit, and then it would pass. So it's going to suggest a new color for you. Not all color contrast calculators will do the suggestion part, but all of them will tell you your contrast ratio, and most of them will tell you if you passed or failed the WCAG standards. There are lots and lots of tools, as I said, and some of them are web-based, which is great when you just need to pop in a couple numbers. And some of them are desktop based. And the nice thing about the desktop based ones is that they usually have an eyedropper. So what I use is called Accessibility Insights, and it's a free download. And it actually does a lot more accessibility stuff than just a color contrast analyzer. Um, but that is what I find it to be most useful for. And it will tell you what your ratio is, whether you passed or failed for regular text, large text, and UI. The TPGI color contrast analyzer is also a really good one. I found, I don't know, last year, I guess, that for some reason it wouldn't show up on my screen when I was presenting. And that's actually what caused me to switch to Accessibility Insights. But as a color contrast analyzer, I really like it. It also has some color blindness testing in it as well, or at least simulation as well. Again, web tools, accessible-colors.com, and then who can use. So I'm going to flip to who can use because this one's a little different. I can put in any color that I want. That was my purple color. So let's just say I'm doing green. Green on white. It will not only tell you whether it fails for WCAG standards, put it back to something decent. It will show you what people with different vision conditions might see. So somebody with regular vision, this is what I see. Somebody, and they do this, you'll see underneath, it'll show the percent of the worldwide population that's affected. What you learn when you get into this is a change to make something more accessible for one group of people may make it less accessible for others. So one way that I use to decide what's most important is to realize who has this condition. For instance, when you hear people talk about color blindness, they're mostly talking about red and green color vision deficiency. But there is also blue color vision deficiency, and there are some people that can't really see color at all. Everything just it's called achromatopsia. They just see shades. They just see levels of basically white to gray to black. But only 0.05% of people have that compared to uh, protanomaly, which is 1.3%, or protanopia, which is 1.5%. So those are both have to do with not being able to see red. And then deuteranomaly and deuteranopia are green. So you can kind of use that if you ever have to make a decision. What you'll notice is down at the bottom, besides the color blindness, there's cataracts, glaucoma, and low vision. Lots of people have cataracts and low vision, especially as we age. So if you don't have them yet, you might have them as you get older. So let's pay attention also to what this text looks like for those people. And then this is less common in paginated reports, but if people are looking at your reports on their phone in direct sunlight or on night mode on a phone, here's what this looks like for them. So I really like this little web-based tool here. What I will show you, oh, I already have it open, is Accessibility Insights. So let's open my report, and we'll just use this report that we were looking at earlier. And I can use the eyedropper. So color 1 is going to be that green color. And then color 2 is its background, which is white. So this is 3.1 to 1. And this is a non-text object. So that's acceptable. We pass the graphical objects. That's what we need. Then I could do the same thing for text. So let's say I pull the background for that darker green, and then it goes against white. This is 4.7 to 1. And that also passes. I think I actually offered feedback on this one to try to make the colors more accessible. So I'm happy to see that it is like that. So we test every different color and background combination in this report. So the green background to the white text, the white background to the dark gray text, the gray bar to the white, the green bar to the white. And these are the same colors, so we don't have to test them again in the trend line. And then if it's graphical, you need at least 3 to 1. If it's text, you probably want 4.5 to 1. And that is how we test. Oh, I clicked it. So there's one other thing that's really useful here, and that is either Chrome or Edge developer tools. Firefox has something similar, but I use Chrome, so I'm going to show you Chrome. If I go to a report and then I open DevTools and scroll towards the bottom, there are some emulators there. And there is one for reduced contrast. So here's what my report looks like for someone who may have a condition that reduces the amount of color that they see. Someone with blurred vision, like glaucoma, can cause some of this. Cataracts may cause this, I think. So that's built right into your browser. I didn't add this in. This is just there. And I hit F12 to open it, but you can open it from the menu as well. All right, color blindness. My soapbox is that most people can see color. Even the color that they have trouble seeing, they see some version of it usually. It's not like they're completely red blind most of the time. They're usually red weak or green weak. There's also blue weak. So when you look at the statistics, more people have color vision deficiency. They're never completely colorblind. Even if it's one color, they're usually weak in that color instead of completely blind in that color. So if you want to call it a more accurate term, it is called color vision deficiency, usually abbreviated as CVD. Um, Again, it's just inability to distinguish red, green, or blue light. Sometimes one, sometimes multiple of those colors, sometimes all of those colors, but that is more rare. It affects about 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women worldwide, which works out to a little less than 5% of the population. So I'm going to show you 2 images. This is how, if you are colorblind, I'm not exactly sure. These probably look very similar. Um, if you are not colorblind, you may see lots of bright reds and pinks and oranges. And there's a green back here and a dark red. Whereas in the second one, this is a simulated version of someone who has trouble seeing red. And so it looks like a bunch of blue to purple to yellow. That's how different something can look to someone with color vision deficiency. That came from Coblis, the color blindness simulator. You can actually take a screenshot of a report, plop it in, and see what it looks like. It is not just red and green, however, because lots of colors have red or green in them, or because we may use a color like gray, which is usually lots of equal parts of those colors. So gray has some blue in it, gray has some green or red in it. So we think red and green, yes, problematic color combination, but also it could be green and brown, blue and purple, green and blue, light green and yellow, blue and gray, green and black. It's not to say that every combination of green and black causes problems. Sometimes we can vary the brightness or darkness or the saturation of the color to make it different enough, even if you don't see the exact color. But just keep these in mind and remember, especially to check your report if you are using these combinations. So we can simulate color blindness in a lot of ways. We can do this when we're planning our colors. If we make a nice color palette beforehand, we do not have to go and check every single item on every single page because we checked our colors while we were planning. I didn't get Adobe open in the background, so let's open that real quick. This is a nice accessibility tool that does both a contrast checker and a color blindness checker. So if I'm planning my 5 colors I would like to use, what this tool is telling me is that colors B and D are too similar. So I may want to change my color until it becomes distinguishable enough. And sometimes it doesn't take that much. Now, B and D are distinguishable according to this Adobe Color tool. So it's a nice way to go, okay, I'm going to use these 5 colors and be confident that your 5 colors are different enough from each other. And then you can check them for color contrast and make sure they're different enough from their background. Color Hexa is another tool that it'll show you different color combinations and simulate different types of color blindness. Um, and then Vengage, I was not aware of this one, but this one was in the Paginated Reports accessibility docs. And so it's kind of cool. It will help you plan your color palette and it'll tell you what the contrast is. It'll also help you plan color vision or color blindness friendly palettes as well. So you can check out those sites. After the fact, we've got our Chrome developer tools or Edge developer tools, depending on your choice, and Coblis. So let's go back to our Chrome developer tools. And we're going to use this report because someone made poor color choices, so it's a good example. And again, you can hit F12 or you can go to developer tools and then go down to the emulation of vision deficiencies. And let's say you can't see red. The sunburst chart, it might be okay. Let's go back. But check out these. Let's do. They're all the same. That's fine. We really won't be able to see the differences between these colors. So there's like a total cost of sales and an interest expense down there, and it's hard because they're small anyway. But when we can't see red, this all kind of looks the same. We get these two because the darkness levels or the brightness levels are different. And if you can't see green, you are in trouble in this report. How on earth do you match the legend to what these are? They all kind of look the same. So that's what we want to be aware of. Here's what it looks like for someone that can't see blue, a little rarer. Here's what it looks like if you can't see any color. Color is a good thing to use. It's super powerful. But if you can still read your report without any color because you mostly just used brightness and darkness, or like the brightness levels of the colors you use stand on their own, that's even better because you've covered most types of color vision deficiency right there. So that is all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll take a couple of these tips forward and make more accessible paginated reports.